The classroom was nearly empty that afternoon, the kind of silence that makes every small sound stand out. The faint scratch of a chair leg on the floor, the soft rustle of papers shifting, the distant hum of a hallway vent. I had stayed behind for extra help, thinking it would be nothing more than a practical review of notes. But as I sat at the desk with my pen in hand, I found myself far more aware of the person across from me than of the work in front of me. She was 42, my teacher, a woman with the kind of presence that never needed to demand attention. It arrived with her the moment she entered the room. Her long black hair fell past her shoulders, catching the late afternoon light that poured through the tall classroom windows. There was a steadiness about her posture, the kind of quiet confidence that only comes with time, yet in her eyes there was something softer, something that hinted at a deeper story behind the role she played each day. I tried to focus on the open notebook between us, on the rows of words and symbols I was supposed to understand, but my attention kept slipping. I noticed instead the faint scent of her perfume, floral, understated, the kind of fragrance that lingers just long enough to remind you it's there. I noticed the way her blouse was rolled neatly at the sleeves, exposing graceful wrists that tapped occasionally against the page when she emphasized a point. Even the way she adjusted her glasses, sliding them up the bridge of her nose with a gentle motion, seemed deliberate, almost mesmerizing. Her voice was steady and calm, low enough that I had to lean in just slightly to catch every word. It wasn't just the content of what she said that kept me still, it was the rhythm, the almost musical quality in the way she explained things. She spoke with patience, never rushing, as if every word mattered. And though I wanted to appear attentive, my mind wandered more often to the small details. The curve of a smile she tried to hide when I stumbled over an answer, the subtle laugh lines that deepened when she let herself laugh openly. I caught myself staring once or twice, quickly lowering my eyes to the page again, but it didn't matter. The air between us already felt different, thicker, heavier, though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. She was just teaching, I was just learning, and yet the space seemed filled with something else. A quiet awareness, an unspoken recognition that stretched beyond roles and rules. I told myself it was admiration, respect, nothing more. After all, she was my teacher, someone I trusted and looked up to. But even in that moment, as I gripped my pen tighter and forced my eyes to follow the lines on the page, I knew I was noticing things I wasn't supposed to. And the more I tried to look away, the more impossible it became. She was walking me through a set of notes, her tone steady, her explanations patient. I was doing my best to follow along, to keep my head clear, but then something shifted. She leaned in. It wasn't dramatic or planned, just a natural movement. Her chair scooted closer, her shoulder angling toward mine as she pointed to a line on the page. But the effect it had on me was anything but ordinary. The distance between us disappeared in an instant. Suddenly, the space I had relied on to keep my thoughts straight was gone. Her shoulder brushed against mine, light but unmistakable. Her hair fell forward, strands brushing against the sleeve of my shirt as she tilted her head toward the notebook. The warmth of her body, so close, made it feel as though the air in the room had shifted, as if every particle of silence now carried a hum. She was still talking, her voice calm, her words deliberate, but my mind began to blur around the edges. I caught fragments of sentences, numbers, key points, but the rest faded into the background. What I noticed instead was how her breath warmed the air just near my cheek, how her perfume, faint and floral, seemed sharper now, pulled into every inhale. I realized then I hadn't heard the last thing she said. Her words had slipped past me, lost in the nearness of her voice rather than the meaning behind it. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to nod, to appear attentive, though my mind was far from steady. It wasn't only distraction, it was awareness. A sharp, undeniable awareness of the fact that she was more than a teacher in that moment. She was a woman, with a warmth and presence so real it drowned out everything else. I felt caught between wanting the moment to last and hoping it would end before I gave myself away. Her eyes lifted from the paper briefly, catching mine. It was only for a second, but it felt longer. She must have seen the uncertainty in my expression, the way I struggled to keep composed. But if she noticed, she didn't show it. She simply returned her gaze to the notes, continuing as though nothing had shifted. And yet, for me, everything had. The moment stretched longer than it should have. She had just finished a sentence, her pen still poised on the page, but I hadn't heard the last few words. I was too caught in the nearness, the warmth that lingered in the space between us. When I finally looked up, I found her eyes waiting, steady, unguarded, meeting mine in a silence that carried more weight than the words we'd been exchanging all afternoon. It wasn't just a glance. It was one of those pauses where everything else falls away. The hum of the overhead vent, the ticking of the clock, even the distant sounds of lockers slamming in the hall. Her dark eyes held me still, and I felt the rush of something unspoken pass between us. For a moment, it was as though the lesson, the books, the titles of teacher and student, were only props in a scene that had shifted without warning. I felt my throat tighten. Part of me wanted to look away, to give her the out she might need, but I couldn't. There was something in her expression, a softness at the corners of her mouth, the faintest crease at her brow, that told me she felt the stillness too. My pen was frozen in my hand, my notes abandoned mid-sentence, and all I could do was hold that gaze. The light outside had changed while we sat there. What had been sharp, golden rays when I first walked in had mellowed into something gentler, the kind of glow that brushed softly across her cheekbones, catching strands of her black hair in a faint shimmer. The classroom felt warmer, not from the sun, but from the closeness pressing in between us. Then, as if realizing the silence had stretched too long, she cleared her throat lightly and shifted back in her chair. It wasn't abrupt, but the movement broke the spell. Her hand slid the notebook slightly closer to me, her voice calm again, as if the pause had been nothing more than a breath. Still, the air felt different now. She pointed to the page, explaining something in her patient, deliberate way, but I found myself watching the curve of her lips as she spoke, the slight rise and fall of her chest when she inhaled. Every detail, every ordinary gesture seemed sharper, loaded with a quiet meaning that hadn't been there before. I tried to focus. I really did. But even as she spoke, the silence from just moments ago echoed louder than her words. It lingered in the room, in the way my chest tightened, in the way I shifted in my seat as though my body couldn't settle. For the first time since walking into that classroom, I understood something had changed. She was still my teacher, yes, and I was still her student. But now there was an awareness hanging between us, an awareness that no amount of notes or polite conversation could erase. And I wasn't sure either of us knew how to step back from it. The session moved forward, but not with the same rhythm as before. Something had shifted, something both of us seemed aware of yet unwilling to name. She closed the notebook gently and set the pen aside, leaning back in her chair with a small sigh, the kind that carries more than just tiredness. I don't always tell my students this, she began, her voice softer than before, but teaching wasn't what I first imagined for myself. Her words caught me off guard. Until that moment, she had always been the image of composure and purpose, someone who seemed to know exactly where she belonged. But as she spoke, I realized there was another side to her, one I had never seen in the classroom's routine. She folded her hands lightly in her lap, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the late afternoon sky was shifting into shades of amber, the kind of light that made her features glow warmly. When I was younger, she continued, I thought I would travel more, maybe write, maybe live a different kind of life. Her lips curved into a small, almost self-mocking smile. Life has a way of pushing you in directions you never thought you'd go. I stayed quiet, not wanting to break the fragile honesty of her words. She seemed lost in them herself, her dark eyes distant, as though replaying old choices and paths not taken. There was a subtle tremor in her tone, the kind that comes from speaking truths usually kept private. I wanted to say something, to reach across the desk and let her know that her presence, her role as a teacher, wasn't something small or wasted. But the words caught in my throat. All I could do was listen, leaning forward slightly, hoping she felt my attention even in my silence. Her hands shifted, fingers brushing over each other restlessly, betraying a vulnerability that contrasted so sharply with the composed woman I knew in the classroom. For the first time, I wasn't seeing just the teacher. I was seeing a woman, 42 years old, confident in so many ways, but carrying quiet weight inside her. She turned back to me then, her smile soft but tinged with something bittersweet. "I suppose I shouldn't burden you with that," she said lightly, as though trying to retreat behind her usual professional warmth. But to me, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a gift, that she trusted me enough to let that veil slip, even just for a moment. I shook my head gently, finally finding my voice. "I don't mind," I said. "I'd rather hear the real things." Her eyes lingered on mine for a second longer than they needed to, searching, as if weighing the sincerity in my words. Then she nodded, almost imperceptibly, as though acknowledging that something had been shared between us, something fragile and real. In that moment, the distance of roles blurred. She wasn't just teaching anymore, and I wasn't just learning. We were two people, sitting in the soft quiet of a classroom, speaking truths neither of us had planned to say. The room had settled into a kind of quiet that felt different from the start of our session. It wasn't the emptiness of a classroom after hours anymore. It was something denser, filled with the weight of everything we hadn't said. Her confession still lingered in the air, softening the edges of her usual professional tone. She reached for the book on her desk, sliding it toward me so I could see the chapter she wanted me to review. The movement was simple, practiced, but in the small space between us, even the most ordinary gestures felt heightened. I leaned forward to take the book, my fingers brushing across the edge of the cover just as her hand lingered there. For the briefest moment, skin touched skin. It was nothing more than a graze, but it was enough to send a rush of warmth up my arm, startling in its intensity. Her fingers were warm, her touch light, but stayed with me, as if the imprint of it pressed deeper than the contact itself. I looked up, almost instinctively, and found her watching me. Her eyes flicked down quickly, as though she hadn't meant to be caught, but not before I saw the same flicker of awareness I felt mirrored there. She withdrew her hand slowly, not abrupt, but deliberate, her movements controlled. She folded her hands together on the desk, the way someone does when they want to keep them still. "That chapter," she said, her voice calm, "is important for the next section. Make sure you understand it." But her words didn't carry the same weight as before. Not because they weren't meaningful, but because the touch had already claimed my attention. My heart beat harder than it should have, my pulse quickening in my wrist where her hand had just brushed mine. The air around us seemed to thicken again, though neither of us spoke of it. I held the book tighter than I needed to, as if it could steady me. She sat straighter in her chair, her posture precise, though her expression carried something softer at the edges, something she wasn't letting spill out fully. The window beside us let in a gentle breeze, stirring a strand of her hair loose across her cheek. She tucked it back behind her ear, but the small, human motion only deepened the moment for me. She wasn't just my teacher, poised and certain. She was a woman, flesh and blood, close enough for me to feel. The silence stretched again, not empty, but charged. It was the kind of pause where words would only break what was already being spoken without sound. I lowered my gaze, not out of shame, but to protect the delicate balance we were both holding on to. It had been only a touch, a hand against a hand, brief and unintentional. And yet, sitting there with the book in my grasp and the ghost of her warmth still tingling against my skin, I knew it was something I would not forget. Because sometimes it isn't the words that change everything. It's the smallest of touches that refuse to fade. The lesson should have been over by then. My notebook was filled with half-finished sentences. The book closed between us, yet neither of us moved to end the session. She remained seated at the desk, her body angled slightly toward me, while I lingered in my chair, as if rooted there by something invisible. The silence that stretched between us was not awkward. It was heavy, alive, almost impossible to disturb. She leaned back against the edge of the desk, folding her arms loosely across her chest. The gesture was casual, but the way her eyes softened when they found mine told me it wasn't distance she was putting up, it was restraint. The golden light of early evening spilled across the classroom, laying long shadows on the floor and framing her in a warm glow. I couldn't look away. "You did well today," she said at last, her voice low, quieter than before. It wasn't just praise for my work. It carried something gentler, more personal. I nodded, trying to answer, but words slipped away before I could form them. My chest was tight, my thoughts tangled. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't the lesson I would remember, that it was her. Her nearness, her honesty, the way she let me glimpse the woman beneath the title. But my voice refused to cooperate. Instead, I shifted slightly in my seat, and the movement brought me closer than I intended. Close enough that the faint brush of her cardigan sleeve grazed against my arm. The contact was accidental, fleeting, but it sent the same electricity through me as before. I froze, waiting to see if she would pull away. She didn't. Her gaze flicked down for just a heartbeat, as though acknowledging the closeness, and when she looked up again, her expression was softer still, open in a way I had never seen during the daylight hours of class. The words hovered there, just beneath the surface. I could feel them pressing at my chest, begging to be spoken. "I see you, not just as my teacher, but as a woman, and being near you feels like something I can't name." She exhaled slowly, her lips parting as if she might say something herself, but then she stopped. The moment stretched longer, the unsaid words filling the space between us with more force than anything spoken aloud. I glanced toward the clock, though I didn't really see the time. We both knew I should go. The session had ended long ago, yet neither of us moved. The golden light was fading, turning the classroom into a place suspended between day and night, between what was proper and what was possible. Finally, she gave me a smile. It was small, polite, but I caught the hesitation at the corners of it. "That's enough for today," she murmured. Her voice was steady again, but her eyes lingered a fraction longer than they needed to. And in that look, I felt all the words we hadn't spoken, words that belonged to the silence, too dangerous to name, yet impossible to ignore. The clock above the chalkboard ticked softly, its rhythm reminding us both of the time we'd already let slip away. She gathered the papers on the desk into a neat stack, her movements calm, though there was a carefulness to the way she handled them, as if she, too, wasn't ready for the moment to end. I closed my notebook slowly, delaying the inevitable. My bag sat at my feet, ready to be slung over my shoulder, but I couldn't bring myself to reach for it. It wasn't just that I wanted more time with her. It was that I didn't want to lose the fragile closeness we had stumbled into, the kind you can't easily recreate once broken. She stood, smoothing the cardigan at her waist, and walked with me toward the classroom door. Her footsteps were soft against the linoleum, the kind of sound that blends with silence rather than disturbs it. I followed, my own steps reluctant. When we reached the doorway, she paused. The hallway stretched out behind her, lined with lockers and lit by the muted glow of fluorescent lights, but she didn't step aside right away. Instead, she turned to me, her eyes searching mine in a way that felt both steady and uncertain at the same time. "Thank you for staying after," she said quietly. It was the kind of thing she might say to any student, and yet it didn't feel that way. Her voice had a softness to it, almost like she was speaking just for me. I gave a small nod, words caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. Before I could think of a reply, she reached out, not quickly, not hesitantly, but with a natural ease, and let her hand brush against my arm. Her fingers rested near my elbow for the briefest second, a touch so light it could have been casual, but everything in me knew it wasn't. The warmth of her touch lingered, even after she pulled her hand back. I could feel my pulse in the spot where her fingers had been, as though my body wanted to hold onto the contact longer than time allowed. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence between us carried everything words couldn't: gratitude, hesitation, longing, and the quiet acknowledgement that something unspoken had passed between us that day. Finally, she offered me a small, steady smile. "Get home safe," she said. Simple, ordinary words. But the way her voice softened, the way her eyes lingered on mine, made them feel like a secret parting. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing softly against the empty floor. Still, I turned once, unable to help myself. She was standing there in the doorway, framed by the warm light of the classroom behind her, her long black hair catching the faint glow. She didn't move right away, didn't turn back inside. She just stood there, watching, her presence filling the space even from a distance. As I walked away, the quiet of the corridor seemed louder than ever, but inside me, everything felt alive. The session had ended, yes, but something else had begun, something fragile, unnamed, and unforgettable.